let's just be clear, he doesn't take the US government for a ride. He puts a lot of risk on the line with this contract. But basically, because he's taking 7 ships and he's taking them into an active war zone, right? And he's taking a concept container ship, which he knows he can work, but the US military, apart from their boxes, they've never done anything like this before. And there isn't a lot of love for this concept on the ground with the guys running the port. They just think it'll make matters worse. So he works really hard, but the terms of the deal are important. So effectively, the US government pays for Malcolm to sail there with its containers, unload the stuff, and then if he sails back, he's already covered the outbound voyage, pays for basically his return. So Malcolm is somebody who can always spell a profit. So if he can make it work on the outbound, he can go to Japan, he can get the stuff, he can get those TVs, those Sony Walkmans, etc., and he can bring them back to America and they can get sold. He can make a lot of money. Now, what he does do, he says, if I'm taking the risk, I can also get a bigger profit on the way back. So last month, we were in Switzerland with Roche, telling the story of modern medicine through one extraordinary capital allocator. And I know you feel the same on this one. I think this month we've taken on something even bigger. We haven't even tried to tell the story of modern medicine. We've tried to tell the story of global trade itself, right? And I think that was such a big challenge, but I must say I have enjoyed the preparation for this episode immensely. And listeners, this month, we're going to tell the story of Denmark's finest, Maersk. Now, I know what you're thinking. Most people don't really think about shipping on a day-to-day basis. We only think about it when something breaks. A ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal, and suddenly we remember that trade runs through these very narrow corridors or choke points. A terrorist group like the Houthis attack traffic in the Red Sea, and a route that looks permanent turns out to be optional and expensive. And remember, we're talking about human lives here, dangerous. And then, again, I think most people would struggle to find the Panama Canal on a map. And I don't think we realize that it's a canal. I know it's in the name, but I think the canal part means the water has to flow down with the boat. And if you don't have enough water falling as rain, the Panama Canal basically doesn't function. And it actually is a limit on global trade. And then last but not least, I think a cyber attack, Russia attacking Ukraine, impacted massively on global trade because for a brief moment, it took Maersk down completely. So I think when we're talking about Maersk, we're not just talking about a shipping company. We're talking about an operating system for physical trade. And listener, this is why I think this episode, amongst all the ones we've done so far, really matters. Because when you stop and think about it, modern life rests on a system that most people never see until it actually fails. So please join us because this is one really important story. And I'll make a commitment to you. If you stay with us to the end, you will not just understand how Maersk became Maersk. You will see the modern world for the first time like I did, because understanding how it was built and how fragile this world is helps you understand where it's going next. And in particular, don't just think about global trade and containers and ships moving around the world. Think about another transformation that's taking place in our lives today. Think about AI. Have that in the back of your mind as we tell this story.
Well, thanks, Colin. That was a great lead into to an exciting episode. I totally agree with you, and the only thing that I want to say as a prelude to our whole story is that the whole modern way of life, starting from the stuff that we have available in the grocery stores, or the stuff that we furnish our homes with, or the vehicles that we ride, everything is based on the dramatic reduction of logistics cost that containers and companies like Maersk were able to make reality. And One of the things we always try to do on Category Leaders is to tell stories that are both timeless and timely. So we didn't choose Maersk just because we love the company. We chose it because I think there are a lot of interesting segues that we can take to today's situation and lessons to be learned. In 25, Maersk as a company generated $54 billion of revenue. It operates in 130 countries, owns 60 terminal locations, and sits right at the heart of the global trading system. And perhaps the simplest way to understand its scale is this: roughly 1 in 7 containers in the world is carried by Maersk. So when we talk about Maersk, we are not really talking about a shipping company in the narrow sense. We are talking about one of the hidden operating systems of global trade and transportation. And what makes the story so interesting is that Maersk repeatedly reallocated capital into the next control point of global trade, from oil, which was a very critical part of their operation in the beginning, to containers, to terminals, to integrated logistics and the related computer systems. And they did it with one thing shipping almost never gives you naturally: time. Time to survive brutal cycles, time to make long bets, time for those bets to pay off. So yes, we are going to tell a story of the humble container, the box, and how it changed the world. We are going to tell you the story of shipping lanes, choke points, freight rates, and why geography still rules modern trade. But before any of that, we have to start earlier. Before the container, before just in time, before cheap finished goods crossed oceans as if distance barely mattered, we have to start with the world Maersk was born into. So, when was Maersk born?
Okay, so Maersk is born in 1904 in Denmark. But before we go just there, I think we have to just remember, we have to resist one very modern, powerful illusion, right? And I'm as guilty as this as anybody, which is the world has always looked like it looks today with just worse tech. Right? That's kind of our presumption of everything was just, before electricity, before this, before that, it was just basically the same. And just to be clear, listener, it wasn't. There was no recognizable version of modern globalization sitting hidden in plain sight. There were no giant ships, there was no long supply chains, there was no cheap finished goods moving across oceans. That's not what happened. The world Maersk is born into in 1904 is not our world with smaller and slower ships. It's a very different economic order, a different geography, and a different relationship between ports, factories, and consumers. And a different relationship, as Marty mentioned, between distance and cost. And unless we really understand this old world, you're not going to understand why the container mattered, and you'll not understand why Maersk became Maersk. So, take your mind back. We are now in 1904. We're standing on a small island in Denmark. Denmark's basically made up of 3 basic islands. This is the middle one, the one that most people don't even think about because it's not Lego and it's not Copenhagen. It's the island of Funen. And right from the beginning, that tells you that this is a story of something happening at the periphery. Because this is not about London or New York or Hamburg. This is a small maritime town, Svendborg, in a small seafaring country that today has a population of 5 million, and in 1904 were well below that. And this company has to think globally basically from day one because it's already on the edge of really the modern world.
Yeah, and when we go even before that, let's talk about the family. Because the family setup tells you a lot about the company before the company even properly existed. Anna and Peter Maersk Møller raised 10 children in Villa Anna in Svedborg. This is not some abstract corporate founding. It's a big, disciplined maritime household in a small town with the sea and shipping not as an idea, but as the texture of everyday life. Peter Maersk Møller first went to sea as a cabin boy in 1850, qualified as a ship's mate in 1855. Later captained sailing vessels Then after the wreck of the Valkyrien in 1883, reinvented himself, studied engineering, qualified as a steamship master at the age of 50, and bought his first steamship Laura in 1886. And that was an extraordinary reinvention. Why? Because commercial sailing ships, those big sailing ships, continued from that point. They continued to sail for another 50 years or so. So somebody investing into a steamship at that point was already looking at the future. And what really matters is that he didn't just buy a steamship and hope. He prepared the family for a steamship future. One son became a navigator, two became engineers, and the fourth, Arnold Peter Möller, or A.P. Möller, trained in shipping. So even before the company exists in the form we know it, the family is already behaving almost like a proto-organization. Roles are forming, capabilities are being built, the future is being prepared inside the household.
I love the fact that this is 10 children, right? In a villa, in a house on Svenborg. And this is the formation of the company. Because we looked at lots of family businesses before. Roche is an example. It's like a solo founder, and it's the family that carries on, and other key employees come in. This is like, I don't know, this is Sound of Music. Like every child has a role, right? Every child has a speciality. This is a family building a company, not effectively a family inheriting a company. And I think it's different. And I think here there's really two protagonists to get your heads around, listeners. There is Peter, he's the father, he's the seaman and the visionary. He's been rooted in this old maritime world, but he sees that basically sail is dying. It's going to take a long time, as Marty said, 50 more years, and steam is the future. And then there is this fourth child, Arnold Peter Muller, or AP as he's known, the son. And he's not the old sea captain. He's the builder. He's the organizer. He's not trained specifically in navigation or something else. He's trained almost in company building. And if Peter is the one who sees the shift, it's AP, and it's AP that we're mainly going to focus on in this first part of the story. He's the one who builds the institution that can live inside that shift. And this is where the company begins to feel real, because Maersk is not founded by generic businessmen. It's not some corporation at this stage. It's a father-son relay. Peter sees the future early, and AP starts building the capability, building the business inside that future.
Yeah, and there's another part of the founding that is so easy to miss if you tell the standard myth of father and son starting a shipping company. They didn't do it alone. The steamship company Svendborg was founded the 16th of April 1904 by A.P. Möller, together with his father and several local businessmen from Svendborg, and it was based in Villa Anna. That matters because it reminds you this is a local commercial coalition at the start, not yet a giant dynastic machine, or not a single entrepreneurial endeavor. It begins as a town-scale maritime venture with local capital, local trust, and local confidence behind it.
I love living in the Nordics. And one of the great things about living in the Nordics is everybody knows everybody. So one of the founders in our earlier portfolio company, his family can trace their roots back to Svenborg, right? And his grandfather actually built a shipyard with AP Muller. So effectively, he told me a bunch of stories about, again, this shipping community on this small island in Denmark, kind of facing the world, raising the capital together because there wasn't anybody else to raise it from, and setting out in the world. And there are echoes of the Bailey Gifford here. That first Straits and Mortgage company, Edinburgh capital, coming together, supporting this reach out. So what we can say with confidence is there's a father and son core, there's a deliberate preparation for a shipping future, right? And there's a very distinctive starting point in this 1904. But what's also very clear is this is an owner-shaped institution right from the beginning. It's the family as the protagonist, and the family building control over a very difficult business, and we'll talk about how difficult shipping is as a business soon, right? This is a high cost, high risk, low margin type of business. Shipping is not easy. So control and family ownership starts right from the beginning, right? And this is what the focus is right from 1904. And it's an easy mistake for the modern listener to make, is that shipping in 1904 means something like shipping today. It doesn't. It's very different.
Yeah. And I mean, that's so true. The world where Maersk entered was the world of break bulk cargo. And that sounds very technical and old-fashioned, but the other thing also to keep in mind is that the world was very different. I mean, we are all used to the open trade, and you can basically ship everything everywhere all at once. But in those days, you had, for example, the European countries had very strong colonies. And you coming from a small nation like Denmark, you don't all of a sudden start shipping between UK and the colonies, or the Dutch colonies, or the French colonies. You have to be very clever. And when we talk about the break bulk cargo, it's about moving countless separate pieces that are not standardized at all. Sacks, bales, crates, barrels, cartons, drums, bags, machinery parts, timber, loose items, everything, with no standardization in size or weight. A shipment comes into port and it has to be assembled, sorted, checked, lifted, lowered into the hold, repositioned and stowed according to all sorts of practical constraints, utilizing very, very skilled people to do this very, very dangerous work. Then at the destination, much of the process happens again. So if the modern container is like a common grammar for trade, break bulk is more like thousands of separate words, all meaning individual handling. Every handoff is work, every interface is cost, every transfer is a risk. And there were genuine risks for all the longshoremen working in the ships and in the docks in those days.
Again, listener, if you don't have a background in kind of boats and stuff, just think about the difficulty of going on a family trip in a car. Most arguments for most families are about getting the stuff in the car, right? Because it's got to be taken out of the house, packed in the house, taken out of the house or apartment, placed in the car, configured correctly. Somebody does all the work, somebody doesn't do the work, stuff gets left behind. It's a mess, and it always takes far longer than you think. Now, put 1,000x on that, right? And put it in a ship, right? With narrow entrances, different size materials, and lots and lots and lots of people, right? And this is where the economics become genuinely interesting, because when people hear old shipping was expensive, they often think that the sea voyage itself, like the wages for the crew, the time aboard the boat, going across the ocean, that's the main bottleneck. But that's not the deepest truth. The real problem, as Marty explained, is the handling. It's when the cargo meets the dock, the labor, the paperwork, the customs, the storage, the timing, the theft. We're going to talk a little bit about the theft, the weather, the transport. So just imagine a port before the container. Like, I grew up near the Liverpool docks in the UK, right? So I have Liverpool kind of in my head, right? A consignment does not arrive as one clean sealed unit. The boat arrives and it's disorder. There are crates on this boat from one shipper that have got to stay on the boat. There are crates that have got to get unloaded in Liverpools. There are sacks from another. The barrels must stay upright. So often you had carpenters working in the holes, putting in a structure around the goods to basically make sure that they actually stayed upright. Fragile goods that cannot get wet, timber that needs different handling. If you have a clipboard, a tally sheet of the stuff and it's missing, you don't know what needs to go where and to whom. Stuff gets damaged, a delay because the right labor gang is not ready. They're down the pub or they're working on another boat because it was delayed. Literally, the logistics of a port are a nightmare, right? a railway wagon is not yet available to take the stuff away. The warehouse that you want to put it into is full. Something gets stolen, something gets broken, something simply waiting. Like, I must imagine that ports at this time, you just kind of like, I can imagine a lot of people standing there tearing their hair out because it's so complicated. And the ship is not the system. The port is the system, and the interfaces are there and the handoffs are there. So in the old world, it's not just about slow transport, it's about weak coordination. And that's the biggest problem.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing is that if you think about the skills needed from the personnel and the physical strength required from the dock workers, it's clearly an area where you cannot just take anybody out of the city and put them to work successfully in those conditions. I mean, these people were doing pretty heroic stuff every single day. And for that reason, they were very proud. Now, if you see the ports that way, many other things all of a sudden become obvious. For example, why so many great port cities were also manufacturing sites? Take New York, London, or Hamburg. In our imagination today, they are finance, service, prestige, cultural cities. But in the older world, they were also places where things were made so that they were very close to the point of shipment. That was not accidental. The world where moving finished goods long distances is expensive, fragile, and hard to coordinate, production sites are very close to the demand. And distance is not just miles. Distance is a handling cost, timing risk, pilferage risk, breakage risk, world capital tied up in transit, and the constant possibility that something goes wrong at once or the many interfaces. So you do not casually make low-value finished goods very far away and ship them across oceans to consumers, not in the way we later came to take for granted. Production sits nearer the market because friction is everywhere, and as a result, when you look at the older cities, you had craftsmen everywhere doing the manufacturing jobs. All villages had their blacksmiths, their shoemakers, everything. Everything was done locally. And the dramatic change came from the revolution of shipping.
Yeah. So again, if you think back to your history lessons, listeners, think about what gets moved by sail and then steam. It's tea from India, right? It's wool from Australia. It's spices. Sadly, it's even slaves, right? These are raw materials. Slaves are just horsepower, basically. Sorry, but they are in those worlds. They're raw materials, they're commodities, they're bulk goods. They are not TVs from China. They're not finished products. The finished product happens at the manufacturing site next to the port. You bring in the raw materials and basically you then construct the product. And these are commodities that can survive the friction, right? The pistachios that can get loaded on the shoulder of the laborer who takes them into the boat, right? It's the steel in the hull, it's the wood and the timber. They can survive the handoffs. And the modern world is a flood of cheap finished goods, basically in steel containers. This is not the world that Maersk is born into. And again, if people look at Maersk today and go, founded in 1904, and then it does containers, they're really flattening the story. Maersk is not born into the world. Later, it comes to symbolize. It's born into the world that had to be replaced because it was super inefficient and super high cost.
Yeah. And that older world teaches Maersk something very important before the company ever becomes elegant or global in the modern sense. It teaches it how hard shipping really is. Shipping is cyclical, balancing supply and demand is difficult, routes change when politics change, capital is exposed at sea, cargo can be delayed, damaged, or devalued, and very little is truly under your control. That is an underrated part of the story. Maersk learns shipping before shipping becomes smooth.
Yeah. So we've set the scene, hopefully. Now let's get back to the real narrative with our protagonist, because What Peter and AP are really bequeathing, what this company becomes, is a governing temperament, right? It's all about seriousness and discipline and prudence and unspectacular competence, an unsentimental adaptation. The sea is not kind, right? It's very unpredictable. Lots of things go wrong. So this company basically has that kind of discipline, seriousness, prudence baked in the same way ASML taking on the law of physics has to basically fight with this bigger and unquestionably difficult foe. Maersk has to basically learn how to manage itself on the sea where it can't control a lot of the variables. So Maersk culture is not formed after success, it's formed before success. The demands of the sea itself really instill in this family and this fledgling business that kind of temperament. So just hold that in your head that this is where the Peter and AP Muller plus the sea combination comes from. So, a world of fragile cargo, political risk, exposed capital, because you're sinking a lot of money into these boats, hard physical condition. This creates the value set that takes the company over this next 100 years. And the family matters because the family holds that DNA over this next period.
Yeah, and the fact that Peter, the father, had been in sail ships is a key element of understanding that old world. There are actually very nice YouTube videos because the sail ship cargo that continued in until the 40s. So there are YouTube videos telling that story. How was it to be on those sail ships? So it's very recommended listening if you have interest in this area. But anyway, the old world, break bulk, expensive handoffs, commodities dominating seaborne trade, manufacturing closer to demand. One cargo flow suddenly stands out as almost perfect for it, and that was oil. That was found in abundance in the first half of the 20s. Oil is ideal for the economics of that area. Huge volume, strategic necessity, standardized flow, movement by sea is the natural answer. So before Maersk becomes the company of containers, before it becomes the company of integrated logistics, before it becomes a symbol of globalization, it first becomes something else. Its first great modern engine is not the container or the box. It's oil.
Yes. So that's where we're going to pick up. We tend to do these episodes, listeners, in 5 acts. So we do the 5 acts, we do then an analysis section, and then a quintessence. So this first act, we've kind of set the scene on bulk break cargo. We've set the scene on the family. Now we're going to move into Act 2, which is all about effectively oil and how Maersk learns how to survive shipping and rebuild after catastrophe. Because sadly, spoiler alert, we're 1904. There's a couple of wars coming up in the next chapter, right? So, oil. It is about volumes, it's huge volumes. There is a standardized movement. It is really important strategic necessity. This is how we move vehicles and how we power things pre-World War One. Oil becomes Maersk's first great engine. Just like Roche had its kind of vitamin engine, which powered the business, oil is really where Maersk starts to move as a business. So before we can kind of really tell the story of oil, you need to look at Maersk becoming a substantial enough company to matter, because it doesn't jump straight to oil tankers, right? Maersk has to survive this kind of battle-tested period of the First World War.
And the First World War is not about the military history detour for us, even if interesting at that, but because we do need to understand where Maersk's depth comes from. The First World War is one of those moments when shipping becomes more dangerous, more political and more economically important all at once. Trade is disrupted, tonnage is scarce, risks rise, but so do the rewards for operators who can continue moving. And that matters because those years helped transform Maersk from an ambitious shipping venture into a business with real ballast. Capital accumulates, experience accumulates, confidence accumulates. So by the time Europe moves toward the next great rupture, This is no longer some fragile little family firm. It's becoming a serious maritime institution.
Yeah, so the tides around World War One really helped Maersk go from that one or two boats to build a kind of fleet type business. So it moves into brokerage. It develops a shipbuilding capability. Remember the founder I mentioned earlier, the kind of the shipbuilding business that he builds with AP, his grandfather. It builds into liner activities and it acts. It enters tankers in 1928. So founded in 1904, gets its first tankers in 1928, and it acquires 5 at once. And it starts the oil kind of engine going, right? So again, it doesn't discover oil after the Second World War. It's already in the oil business from 1928 onwards. But effectively, it's World War II that really changes the dynamic for the whole company. So we're skipping a few decades here because Maersk's story really kind of starts now.
Yeah, indeed. And that interwar growth is already very meaningful. By 1940, Maersk Tankers has 11 crude carriers in service and is the largest tanker operator in Scandinavia. That's a very, very important number because it tells you oil is already a serious part of the company before the war begins. It's not an experiment tucked away at the edge of the fleet. So when we talk about Maersk and oil, the right sequence is this. First, the company enters tankers in the late 20s. Then it builds a meaningful pre-war tanker position. Then war nearly breaks the fleet. And only after the war does the tanker business become the great commercial engine of the age. That sequence is very, very meaningful.
Not all time is equal. And there's a particular scene, I think, in Maersk history that needs to be told, because I think this is a pivotal one for Maersk. So, it's 9th of April, 1940. Germany occupies Denmark. Basically, sorry, Denmark, they don't stand a chance. Germany's army is like a lot better, and they just swoop in and take over Denmark. Maersk has a fleet of 46 ships at this time. Okay, so this is a real business, right? Now, fortunately for Maersk, 36 of those 46 ships are outside Danish waters on this 1940 date. On the night before the occupation, AP and his son, Maersk McKinney Moller, right, and we'll hear more about him later, they send urgent telegrams to all the Maersk ships outside Danish territory. And basically the message is this: Denmark has fallen, head for neutral ports, stop following our orders.
Well, that's
End of telegram / email, right? And
yeah.
it's one of these moments where the company basically, like, this is, they could so easily have folded at this point, but they basically push the boats to outside Denmark and hope for the best.
Yeah, and rather than being knocked out, Maersk is definitely not freezing. It's taking an action mode. Do not wait. Do not panic. Move first. Preserve what you can still control. And that instinct is not just admirable, it is decisive for the future of the entire company. Because in a crisis like that, the difference between acting before the trap closes and acting after the trap already closed can be the difference between losing half your business and losing the whole thing. So those simple telegrams are not just clever, they are preservative and they keep options alive.
Yeah, and again, when I read through the history of Maersk, Marty, this feels like the scene in Forrest Gump, right? Where effectively they go out to sea, they survive the storm, they come back, and everybody else's boats are wrecked. So they go from basically not being able to make any money, basically in shrimp fishing off Alabama, to basically being able to catch all the shrimp because they're the only ones with boats left. And this kind of feels a little bit like Maersk. Because they pushed their fleet away, they did actually have that opportunity to kind of rebuild. So again, Maersk rebuilds quickly after the war, not because the tankers magically rescue it, but because effectively they had enough fleet to basically keep their business going. So they're damaged, but they're not destroyed.
Indeed. And some of the ships trapped in Danish waters are effectively forced into carrying German coal and coke to Denmark. But the foreign fleet is another matter. Control over that fleet is handed through the overseas networks, especially via New York. Maersk and Maersk McKinney Møller goes to the United States to help the international commercial relationships together through the war. So yes, the war does enormous damage, but it does not wipe out the operating core. And that distinction is everything.
Yeah, so again, this is historic numbers, so the numbers don't really hide the human cost of what happens. Wars are tragic, people die, everyone is effective. So by the end of World War II, the fleet has been cut from 46 ships to 21, right? They lose 25 ships. That's 150 seafarers are killed. Like, that's half the people that they know gone, right? That's re-
huge.
that's really bad. That's really bad, right? But they're definitely down but not out, right? And again, this fleet, but so many other businesses completely go to the wall, right? So Maersk is a survivor. It loses half its business, but it doesn't lose everything. So the company is tested, but it comes out in the 90s, it comes out and is able to rebuild because it's not out of the game.
Yeah. And I think the cleanest way to frame the recovery is this. Maersk does not restart from zero in 1945. It restarts from damage. And this is the difference. If the whole fleet had been trapped, if the commercial relationships had been collapsed, if the command structure had disintegrated, then this would be a story of burial and reinvention. But this is a story of partial preservation under extreme pressure. Enough ships survive abroad, enough relationships survive abroad, enough authority survives, enough commercial memory survives. So when the war ends, Maersk is damaged, but not institutionally dead. And that's why the rebuild can happen so fast.
And again, listeners, just this is an important point. So after the war, 1945, Europe's peace, but it's in ruins. Within about 3 years, so by 1948, 1949, Maersk is back to its pre-war tonnage levels. It's lost half its fleet, and yet it's rebuilt within 3 years. This is extraordinary,
It
right?
is.
And it's not a miracle. It's three things working together. There is a pre-war death. They know how to run a business, right? And they basically are able to preserve that during the war. And then there is this explosion and opportunity, Marshall Plan, etc., etc., in a post-war speed. They're one of the survivors. They're one of the few companies that can continue to move oil around the world. The world still needs oil, and Maersk responds.
Yeah, and only now do we get to the strategic question at the heart of the act. Once Maersk has rebuilt, where does it place its weight? What is the great flow of the post-war world? What is the material current that matters most? And the answer is crude oil. Not because someone at Maersk falls in love with tankers as an idea, and not because this is some kind of a grand ideological reinvention, but because oil is the most rational seaborne flow of the age, and essentially this is what your customers wanted. It's not something you were serving the customers at the time. And oil was in the middle of it.
Yeah, and again, I think that oil is such a dominant part of this century, right? So it's not a massive surprise that the companies that basically travel or manufacture oil become the most important companies in this century, because oil is that continuous putting blood into the economy, raising GDP, increasing industrialization, changing the world order. Middle East becomes more important, etc., etc. All of this happens, and it's not a massive surprise that oil is a big part of Maersk's story. And then, but again, remember, listeners, they started their tanker business in 1928. It's really only in the 90s through to the 70s that it becomes their primary seaborne kind of profit line. So it's a tanker business in the 1950s and 70s, and oil and Maersk is very important about taking oil around the world.
Yeah, and this is probably the time to look what a tanker actually is, because tanker is just yet another ship carrying different sort of cargo. It belongs to a very different business logic, different from the break bulk cargo that we were talking about earlier. Break bulk is very, very labor heavy, interface heavy, friction heavy. A tanker moves a standardized liquid bulk flow in a purpose-built vessel. No sacks, no crates, no containers actually. No separate pieces needing endless rehandling. No army of workers, specialized workers, unionized workers, sorting and resorting at every interface. Just very large volumes of liquid cargo moving through a system designed for scale. At the large end, the numbers are extraordinary. A VLCC, a very large crude carrier, can carry on the order of 2 million barrels of crude oil. That is completely different scale from the old cargo world. The tanker is almost like a floating pipeline.
Yeah, and again, I think that this is fascinating. Like, we talked about commodities and sugar and spice and tea moving around the world, but they were generally, if it was on a dedicated ship, it was all about speed to market. Get my tea back first to England, sell it for a good price. Here, please, listener, see the tanker as a floating pipeline, right? Most oil moving around the world or gas is moved in pipelines, less in ships, certainly across Europe and certainly where the continents join up. Here, the tanker as a floating pipeline is this post-World War fit, right? Because oil is not just oil. Oil is steel and chemicals and cars and plastics and heating and transport and electricity and industrial growth. It is everything. It kind of builds the modern economy on which we live. Factories run on it, homes are heated by it, cars consume it, ships consume it a lot, aircraft consume it. Everything that you look around comes from oil, and Maersk is the company that moves oil, right? So this is not a massive surprise that this becomes the defining commodity, and it's much easier to move than the other ones, that basically is one of the biggest and most strategic flows on Earth.
Yeah, and you can actually see that business growing in hard numbers. By 1965, the tanker fleet had grown to 31 tankers with a combined capacity of almost 1 million tons deadweight. And the first two product tankers have joined the fleet as well. So this is not just a company carrying more crude, it's a business becoming more sophisticated and more varied inside the liquid bulk world. That matters because it shows what oil really means, gives Maersk. Not just revenue, it gives the company scale, fleet discipline, asset intensity, route discipline, and strategic relevance. In other words, it gives Maersk weight.
So, go back a little bit to what we said about AP. It's all about discipline and prudence and conservative in a kind of like managed things. So Maersk is really focused on this, right? It's matter of fact, it's pragmatic, it's commercially makes sense. It's not the loudest market, it's not the most glamorous market, it's not about what makes us look important. It's about what can we move with economic discipline, with reliability, how can we build a disciplined position, right, in a very unpredictable. Remember, we've gone through World War One and World War Two at this point. How can we move this commodity around the world and get it to the places where it's importantly needed on time, on budget?
Yeah, and that's why this act matters so much. This is not a story about tankers as some side business on the road to containers. It's the first major proof that Maersk understands the structure of the world it is in. In the old maritime order, before mature containerization, the sea still overwhelmingly favors bulk commodities, energy, and strategically indispensable flows. Oil is the strongest of all those flows, so Maersk's move into oil is not accidental. It is the company's first really successful act of large-scale strategic allocation.
Shipping is a business where scale matters. Like when we come to the analysis section and we judge Maersk against scale economies and network economies and counter positioning, ultimately it's not a massive surprise we're going to land on Maersk has scale economies, right? Because effectively this business, shipping, moving freight from point A to point B, is a scale economies business. Yeah. So bigger ships can lower unit costs provided the routes and terminal systems can handle them. We've already seen that the handling is the biggest problem. So tanker shipping pushes Maersk towards a different type of thinking. It's about long horizon thinking, asset heavy thinking. These tankers are expensive. Infrastructure thinking. How do we maintain these tankers? How do we keep them on the fleet? How do we keep them moving? How do we kind of manage the interface at the port so that the boat is always busy? It becomes a system thinking problem, right? This is not just about carrying oil. It's about learning how to operate at industrial scale globally. Remember, Maersk now operates in 130 countries, right? Inside a strategically critical system with high degree of capital concentration, right? And this is a really important apprenticeship for what comes later.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm very happy that you emphasize the asset-heavy thinking because it's very easy to count numbers. Say you have 31 boats or ships or whatever, but when you look at these ships, they are massive and they are massively expensive. So it must have taken a huge amount of courage to make those investment decisions without having certainty how the future will look like. So this is very, very important in the whole story. But clearly, oil being a great engine in these times is not the final answer. And the far end of the story makes that clear. When Maersk Tankers is sold in 2017, it is still a real business with real competence and real scale. In 2016, it generated 877 million US dollars in revenue, 62 million in the profits after taxes, and with a return of invested capital of just 3.7%. It operated 106 vessels and employed 2,400 people. The sale was done at an enterprise value of 1.17 billion US dollars, and by then against a group revenue base of roughly 0.5 billion. So I mean, just think about it. It was very, very important, and all of a sudden, it's something like 3%
of the company.
entire corporate.
Absolutely, yeah. It goes from being the big thing to being. Sorry, which bit of the business are you in today? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that, and still as of today, oil is pretty much as important as ever. It only shows how much the rest of the stuff has actually grown. Anyway, the tankers eventually not going to be the center of gravity for the whole company. Those are the real numbers. That's the serious business. But it's not the kind of economics that naturally justify keeping the whole group centered on tankers forever. So that's where our story is evolving.
Yes. Again, I think oil is definitely, I think, Marty, you hit it really well. Oil's the right engine for its age, but it's clearly not the final form for this company. But I think, again, I hark back to some of our previous episodes. With our Bailey Gifford episode, the first one we did on category leaders, we found that Japan was the proving ground for Bailey Gifford. That was the country and their time in the 90s that allowed them to really hone their pitch on what investing in category leaders looks like. And again, I see the same thing with Maersk today. Oil and the profits that they could make from oil and the discipline that they had to have to basically build a global infrastructure around oil. This teaches Maersk a really valuable lesson, right? And I think that sets them up in the same way Japan set Bailey Gifford up for its tech play in America and its tech play in China. I think that the oil generation, this oil engine, doesn't just generate profits for Maersk. It actually allows them to think more about where their business will go in the future. So again, I think it sets it up. It's the architecture of trade, but something bigger is coming, and we've already foreshadowed it enough. It's not just a new cargo, it's a new way of organizing cargo.
Yeah, indeed. And The one important element that I mentioned earlier was that when Maersk was starting, you had the European countries with colonies all across the globe. They were controlling that traffic. But the oil was also a way of accessing those shipping routes that were not dominated by these colonialists. And that's really, really making this opportunity to grow and learn the global business that makes it so valuable.
Yeah,
Now,
Denmark doesn't have an empire. Sorry,
no,
like Vikings did a lot of raiding, right? And the Vikings, Scandinavia, are part of it, but they didn't have an empire. They just built and took over parts of Britain
yeah,
and France.
yeah, and essentially the oil, it was pretty much the invention of the 20th century. That's when it massively started growing. But anyway, we eventually get to something even bigger when the new cargo comes along. It's not just a new flow, it's a new system. And that's what takes us to the next act, the Act 3.
Act 3. So, listeners, oil is Maersk's first great engine, but the container is the moment the world around Maersk changes shapes, right? And it seems really strange because the container in itself is just a steel box. You've all seen them. You know, whether you've seen them on boats, whether you've seen pictures in the news, whether somebody's converted a container into a greenhouse or a podcasting studio or whatever, they are everywhere today. Yeah. And again, if you go onto YouTube and ask for the history of the container, you'll often get a very simplified version, right? Because it's one clever man invents a metal box, puts it on a ship, and suddenly we have globalization. And if you've only got 6 seconds, that's probably all you're going to say, right? But believe me, that's not what happened, right? Life doesn't always work out like that because the box is not the real breakthrough itself. And the inventor of the container didn't just invent the container, it's the system. The real breakthrough around the shipping container or the box is the system. And then it's about standards, not sexy, but standards. And once the shipping container in its current form becomes a standard, it starts forcing every other part of the trade system to reorganize around it. Okay? So that's ships and ports and cranes and trucks and railway and military logistics. Military plays a big part in this in the standards. We'll come to that later. Customs, contracts, manufacturing locations, and even the map of which countries become industrial powers are shaped by the standards and the system of the box. And the box didn't stop at the port. If it had, we just would have had more efficient ports. It forces the world to coordinate.
Yeah. Maersk was not the one who to invent the box, the container. They actually got into containers, I think it was 1975 or so, almost 20 years after the first container ship had shipped. So we need to go to United States and we need to introduce Malcolm McLean, who was our third protagonist here and really the guy who has been named as the key inventor of the container. And he was not just an inventor staring at the dock and having a flash of inspiration. He was already a serious operator in land transport. Born in North Carolina in 1913, he starts his trucking company in his early 20s when he realizes he can be paid for borrowing a truck and moving fuel to a nearby gas station. By the early 50s, he had built McLean Trucking into the largest trucking fleet in the American South and the fifth largest in the United States with 1,776 trucks and 37 terminals along the eastern seaboard. So he knows the freight system from the roadside, not from the seaside. And what matters, and that matters because shipping is bad. What he sees is that the handoff from land to sea shipment is bad. The real stupidity is not the sea crossing itself, it's the constant unpacking, packing, reloading, waiting, resorting, and rehandling between truck, dock, warehouse, and ship. So his first insight is not really maritime at all. it's intermodal. It is, why are we breaking the cargo apart every time it crosses an interface?
Absolutely. And look, Marty, I don't know what you think about Malcolm, but he is definitely one of the favorite protagonists that we've covered so far on Category Leaders for me, right? Because he's not just coming from humble belongings like Leonardo da Vecchio of Luxottica fame. He starts his trucking business early, and throughout his life. And readers, if you don't, the listeners, if you get a chance, do definitely read The Box by Mark Levinson, right? Which is a great narrative and a lot of work with the source for a lot of the material that we're going to tell in certainly this Act 3. And it's a really great story about Malcolm McLean and a lot of the financial ingenuity and leveraged buyout. He does the first leveraged buyout in American history. So he does a lot of stuff. And we're not going to tell the 6-second version, but we're not going to tell the 12-hour version either. So dig into Malcolm McLean. He is a truly transformational character. Goes from 1913 to 2001. So he has a very long run and he does an awful lot. So back to our story. This is where the economics become really important, right? Because in the old break bulk world had a very particular cost structure. So think economics in the port. The ships themselves were not actually that expensive. If we go back to we're winding the clock back from where we were in Maersk, we got to about the 1970s and the Ride of Oil. Now go back to where Malcolm is. Malcolm's timeline starts in 1913, builds his trucking empire, and we're really in the 1950s now. So World War II is over, and effectively we're in that period. So the ships themselves are not the expensive part, especially after World War II, because the American manufacturing base produced these Liberty ships. So again, this is the cheap ships that America produced on bulk as part of World War II to get goods across the Atlantic and basically save Europe from basically starvation. Now, they were cheap because effectively they were produced very, very quickly. Well done, America. They didn't necessarily have a great longevity because they might get shot by a torpedo or a U-boat or bombed, right? And they were there to just get stuff across the Atlantic. After World War II, there's tons of these that effectively are lying around. So they're available for purchase from 1947 onwards. The Liberty ships existed. Their hulls were cheap, right? And so the real cost, the real economics in the port is about the dock labor, the delay, the pilferage. Very easy to steal stuff if you're carrying it yourself and there's not a clear tally sheet for what's in the boat. The damage, the paperwork, the congestion, the storage, the uncertainty. We've covered all this before. So this is why break bulk could be so brutally expensive. The cargo got touched again and again and again. So McLean is not really asking at this point, how do I build a better ship? He's asking, how do I stop freight being unpacked every time it changes mode from water to rail to highway? And that's a much better question to ask somebody outside the system. Remember, he's a trucker guy, right? He's built a trucking empire, and now he's starting to look at ships simply because the highways post World War II, particularly from Newark down to Houston, are starting to get congested. We don't have the interstate system at this point. It's starting to get busy. His trucks are starting to get delayed. So he starts to look at the sea, which really hasn't had any trade on it post World War II because of, again, the threats from Germany. And there's no trade going around the coast that much because Europe's kind of dead, right? We've kind of run out of money. We can't trade with Europe because we've lost our manufacturing base too. So that's the frame of mind that McLean's in.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing is that the time it took to unload a ship and move the stuff to a land transportation ecosystem, and seeing how many people with specialized skills and capabilities are needed. I mean, of course, it was clear that there's a huge amount of labor hours that are spent in those transitions, and eventually, what this means is that you cannot just bolt on the shipping business to the trucking business, even if the possibility of having how could I move the truck to the ship or back? The idea is there, but the US regulations do not allow that so clearly. So in 1955, he sells his 75% stake in McLean Trucking for $6 million in order to buy a speculative shipping venture. I mean, he's essentially disrupting himself. And this is not a side bet. That is a man selling a successful business he already controls in order to pursue the system he thinks should exist. He buys Pan-Atlantic. I mean, he's disrupting himself. He buys Pan-Atlantic, renames it Sealand, and effectively bets his fortune on solving the land-sea interface. That's much more dramatic story than man invents box. This is a trucker who has lived the problem, forced by regulation to choose one world or the other, choosing the future over the business he already owns.
Yeah, so again, just think of yourself in Malcolm McLean's shoes. You've built a very successful trucking business, right? Regulators mean that you can't basically suddenly buy a shipping business. You're not allowed. You basically have to kind of sell the business that you have. It's very successful, and trucking will go on to be very competitive for this period. But you see something is wrong in the world, right? This is the classic founder story. You see something is wrong in the world, you see there's an opportunity, and you now make it your life's mission to do that. And you're doing that from a position of effectively selling your family assets to be able to do that. So in April 1956, the Ideal X, this is the name of the ship, sails from Newark to Houston. So McLean buys it, makes a number of modifications, and basically it carries 58 containers. Now these containers are containing coke and low value items, because it's really about showcasing that effectively this voyage matters, that the Coast Guard, the US Coast Guard, will sign off that putting metal boxes on a boat will not capsize the boat, will not damage and endanger the this is the starting gun. Sealand can make basically this service, and the economics are insane, Marty, right? So on this Ideal X aspect, they work out that they are 94% cheaper than breakbulk, right? The costs of taking something from Newark to Houston is 94% less than breakbulk and faster. So with those sort of economics, it's not a massive surprise that effectively McLean has this huge, this is like selling oil for the first time, right? This is a real opportunity. But, and this is where it would be very easy to tell the story of, yeah, it's 94% cheaper, the whole world adopts containerization, off we go. But that doesn't happen because one company's solution is not a global system, right? And a proprietary format is not a standard. This is McLean going, I've got a boat. How many containers, 33-foot containers, can I stick on this boat, right? It's the constraints of the boat that he buys that sets the first container. But that's not a system, because if a box cannot be reliably lifted, locked, stacked, moved, counted, insured, and received, then you've not changed the world. You've just basically created a slightly better thing for yourself. And this takes engineering. And what we love about Malcolm McLean, he is a founder, he is inspirational, he's a risk taker, he's a financial operator, he is not an engineer.
Yeah, and I mean the of course he doesn't know it at this time, but it's going to be around 10 years before the standardization finally is achieved. And what is critical is that rather than McLean solving everything all by himself, this is where Keith Tandlinger becomes absolutely central. He didn't invent the idea of a box. What he did was to solve the boring but decisive problems that make systems work. The corner casting, the twist lock, the lifting points, the assumptions that the crane, truck chassis, the rail car, ship, poles, all recognize the same unit. And once those things become standardized, the box stops being a clever object and starts becoming a language of a shared system eventually across the different countries and continents. The crane knows what it is picking up. The ship knows what it stacks. The truck knows what it carries. The rail system knows what it receives. the port knows how to design around it. That's not just better shipping, that's the birth of a coordinated ecosystem.
Agreed. And again, listeners, just appreciate railways have different dynamics to ships, right? So if I'm a ship captain, I'm worried about the boxes moving and destabilizing my vessel. I'm worried about weight distribution. So what's in this box and how heavy is it versus what's in this box and how light it is. I need to stack these things. I need to make sure they don't fall and damage my ship and damage my crew. A railway has a completely different set of constraints, right? I'm not really carried about weight distribution. I care about the strength of the boxes because they might bounce into each other as we move into a particular siding. So I'm focused on effectively the strength of the corners and the thickness of the steel. And then I'm a truck operator. I care about different things, right? I'm a crane operator. I care about different things. So just because Malcolm and Keith invent effectively the IP for the box, it doesn't mean that other people suddenly go, well done, that's fantastic, let's adopt it, hand over fist, right? The world sadly doesn't work like that, right? So what we really have to spell out hopefully now is containerization is not a hardware revolution. It's really a coordination revolution. It takes time for people to adopt these standards because at the beginning there is no standardization. There are 8-foot containers and 12-foot containers and 33-foot containers, and it's all different, right? And effectively, if breakbulk world, every interface is its only messy negotiation, the container world doesn't really take off until we get standardization, until we get the cargo staying inside, that it's a disciplined unit across multiple stages. So this is one of the real challenges. Even that 94% drop in cost can't be realized if the next person doesn't accept my 33-foot container, right? If the railway doesn't accept my fixtures, my twist lock. It just doesn't work. Yeah. So effectively, initially, we invent the container and then the world just carries on, right, as it was before. And it's not really. But what we do at this point is we start thinking about the cost is not just the voyage, it's all the touching, waiting, sorting, and uncertainty. The containerization kind of starts to get people focused on the real problem. And the real problem is that handoff.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a fascinating 10 years of having different groups trying to standardize everything. But if we think about the economic shift in the break bulk world, especially after the Second World War, when there were a lot of different ships available cheaply, the ships could be very generic. But in the container world, all of a sudden that starts to change. The interfaces become specialized, not generic. You need very specialized cranes, specialized terminals, stacking yards, truck access, rail access. You need deeper waters when the ships are getting bigger. You need more land around the ports. You need genuine planning. So the ships get more capital intensive, the terminals get more capital intensive, and the whole visible system gets more expensive. And this is interesting. There's just one segue. You said that you were born and raised close to Liverpool. There was one of the sources was referring to a McKinsey report around 1965. So 9-10 years after the first containerized ship moved, the organization that is running the Liverpool port got a recommendation by McKinsey saying that you should consider containerizing your port. And when the port captain looked out of the window, he didn't see any containers anywhere, so he declined any such proposal. And that was 9-10 years after the first containers had already moved. So it's quite great if you think how dramatic the change eventually is going to be, and you need a very systematic approach, because to really make this whole system function, you have to make sure that the interfaces are not leaking value, creating slop of the system. So this is not a cheap box, cheap world. It's a more expensive infrastructure, much cheaper coordination, and eventually shipment per item or shipping cost per ton is going to go down dramatically.
Yeah, and I think it's that economic driver that changes everything. Now, listeners, we're skipping over a whole lot of detail because effectively ports are highly unionized. We're in the 1950s in America, particularly the whole "our unions communist?" There's the whole thing kicks off. There's a huge amount of theft. Then there's the fact that the ports have not been invested in. Then the boats can't be move into these ports because these boats are more specialized, but the ports are 100 years old. Everything happens all at once, right? But fundamentally, when we come out the other side of that, and it's a whole interesting segue, so do read Mark Levinson's The Box. It's absolutely fascinating. It's the change starts to slowly happen. The tide starts to slowly change. Not yet, but it's going to start changing because you no longer need to make the stuff close to the customer. Remember that effectively New York is not a finance center, it's a manufacturing center at this point. Right? You can start separating out production from demand. You can start to trust the timing wars. The sea voyages become a little bit more reliable than you can, right? You can move components and half finished goods rather than moving commodities. You can build a modern supply chain. And at this point, we kind of need to do a little bit of a segue into kind of East Asia. So we're gonna, we started in Denmark. We focused very much this act in America and the invention of the container and the shipping system, but it's East Asia that now becomes the next driver, and we've managed to cover World War One, World War Two, and Marty, we have another war coming up.
Yeah, and that's the Korean War that has a story. I mean, in these times, East Asia was not the manufacturing center of the world, not at all. And the quality of Chinese or Japanese goods were let's say not endorsed by everybody in the Western world.
It was not a compliment to say made in Japan.
Exactly. Anyway, Korean War comes. It's not about the containers in Korean War as such, but the Korean War and the whole war effort is actually helping to reactivate Japanese industry at exactly the moment it needs demand. Within the first year of the Korean War, US-led special procurements in Japan reached about 340 million US, and over 4 years they amounted to roughly 2.4 billion. And they were not niche purchases. They ran across metals, machinery, textiles, transport equipment, chemicals, food, machines, basically the bones of a modern industrial economy being jolted back to life, and only due to the vicinity of the war effort. Anyway, the Japan's recovery is not just some vague post-war miracle. This mattered immensely. It accelerated by war demand, industrial rebuilding, and export momentum. And once Japan starts industrializing and exporting at scale, the need for a better maritime system becomes structurally much more important.
Again, this is something I learnt as part of this episode, right? Is kind of British educated. You kind of like, okay, so the UK is the shipbuilder of the world. We have an empire. We have the Royal Navy. We have the East Indian Company. We need a lot of ships. So we're the guys that make ship. UK, go UK. Then basically we pass the torch to America. America makes ships, right? The Liberty ships. We just talked about them. American, it's manufacturing base pre-World War II. It isn't making guns and stuff. It's basically making Model T forts. So World War II, America becomes the shipbuilding capital of the world because they pump out all these Liberty ships. And then there's a glut of them on the market. There's too much supply, so they don't do anything. And then like nobody needs to build ships because effectively there's too many on the market. Now, this Korean War and this Japan rebuilding changes everything, right? And I hadn't thought about this, right? Because what happens is that effectively you need specialized ships. So who's going to build these specialized ships? It's not America's turn. America's kind of done that its thing. It's moved on to other aspects. You need yards that can build specialized ships. You need steel capacity. You need engineers. And you need export demands to make sure those ships are full. And I hadn't realized this, you need banks willing to finance low margin, capital heavy industries. And this is where the Bretton Woods world really matters, right? Because what happens is this fixed exchange rates, everything pegged to the dollar, led, particularly in Japan, to export led industrial growth. Domestic banking systems rise. They have a huge kind of amount of dollars sitting on their hands. They can't suddenly exchange them for Japanese yen because they'll devalue the currency. It's not allowed. So they need to put the money somewhere. So they need capital intensive businesses. This is the same as big venture capital funds like A16 and Sequoia raising a ton of money. They need places to put that money. Oh, that's so helpful. OpenAI and Anthropic need a lot of money and so on, right? You know, you need one needs the other. At this point in time, the Japanese kind of these export banks, they need to put capital. So they really invest in the shipbuilding business. So Japan does this, South Korea does this, and China does this. Please do not think it is the cost of labor in these countries that makes shipbuilding happen in these countries. That is part of the equation. It is not the full equation. It is the export difference. It's the basically the fact that they are exporting large numbers of goods. They know the boats are going to be full. It's the expertise that comes with this. And it's the Bretton Woods system that basically builds everything and turns the East Asian shipbuilding is to the next generation from UK, America, and now East Asia building ships. They reinforce each other.
Yeah, exactly. And now we hit the really important hinge. We remember that the IDLX sailed in 1950. The logic for containers is there. The box works. But for a while, the world still does not fully change. Why? Invention is not enough. Logic is not enough. Even a good cost saving is not always enough. Without standard ports, yards, routes, and industrial scale around it, the container is still just a clever solution looking for a world. And then comes the next conflict, and that's the Vietnam War. And Vietnam is where containerization stops being a promising commercial idea and proves itself under the worst possible pressure. Yet another war.
Yes. So if who you're going to war with determines who builds ships, then the Vietnam War is the moment, right? You know, if we've been signaling out moments in this episode, there is the 1940 sending the telegrams and saving the fleet in Denmark moment. And I would say that this is probably the next most important moment in the story, because this is the moment where effectively the containers build a standard, and it's the US military that has to set that standard. None of this 8 foot, 12 foot, 24 foot, whatever you want standard, because Vietnam is a mess, right? You only have one deep water port. It's run by the South Vietnamese generals. Stuff is going missing. Things are piling up. It's chaos would be a polite way of saying what's happening here. It's a total mess. And obviously, the people who are suffering are the troops on the ground fighting in very difficult conditions on the American side, and they got no supplies, or they've got too much of one thing. There is no mature, frictionless deep water container system. There are bottlenecks, theft, congestion, delay, pressure, waste. So in 1967, the Military Sea Transportation Service contracts with Sealand, Malcolm McLean's company, to run container ship service into Vietnam. Now, this is not some plot twist. Malcolm has to go to Washington, D.C. He has to strong arm people. He has to basically take a huge risk as a founder that he will deliver containers into an active war zone on time, at scale, get the goods off the containers and to the troops. So this is a $70 million contract. This is 1967. This is a $70 million contract under which Sealand is to move 720,000 tons of containerized cargo annually at 15-day intervals using 7 ships from the US to Vietnam. And the first container ship, the SS Bienville, arrives at Da Nang port in July 1967, carrying 226 vans loaded with 7 tons, 7,000 tons of cargo. It takes them 15 hours to offload it. And normally, and this is the important point, that amount of cargo would normally have taken 5 days. 15 hours, 5 days. It's not a small efficiency gain. This is a massive validation. This is a huge risk for Sealand, but it pays off.
Yeah, and I mean this sounds like a successful startup pitch.
Yes.
You are promising to do something 10 times better than the incumbent, and that really happened here. Now, the benefits and the proof of concept that is now true here is much bigger than the military usefulness. The containers are locked. They move quickly. Pilferage falls. Pier space is freed up. Congestion collapses. The handoff becomes more disciplined, and suddenly you can see the deeper truth. Containerization is not just a way to move cargo. It's a way to make a logistics system behave. And the business point is equally important. The story doesn't end with military delivery to Vietnam. The return leg matters, because once you have container ships running into Vietnam and the wider Pacific military system, the commercial logic of backhaul becomes crucial. And that's where Japan enters again. The ships don't have to return empty. They can connect to the rising industrial export base of Japan. So war logistics and East Asian industrial takeoff are not separate stories. They interlock. That's why Vietnam is such an important hinge. It proves the system under extreme pressure and connects military logistics to the commercial geography of the Pacific.
Agreed. And Malcolm negotiates a very good contract. Now, let's just be clear. He doesn't take the US government for a ride. He puts a lot of risk on the line with this contract. But basically, because he's taking 7 ships and he's taking them into an active war zone, right? And he's taking a concept container ship, which he knows he can work, but the US military, apart from their boxes, they've never done anything like this before. And there isn't a lot of love for this concept on the ground with the guys running the port. They just think it'll make matters worse. So he works really hard, but the terms of the deal are important. So effectively, the US government pays for Malcolm to sail there with its containers, unload the stuff, and then if he sails back, he's already covered the outbound voyage, pays for basically his return. So Malcolm is somebody who can always spell a profit. So if he can make it work on the outbound, he can go to Japan, he can get the stuff, he can get those TVs, those Sony Walkmans, etc. We're at this point in the 1960s, and he can bring them back to America and they can get sold. He can make a lot of money. Now, he doesn't take the US government for a ride, but what he does do, he says, if I'm taking the risk, I can also get a bigger profit on the way back. So this is what happens. Exports rise, and this is the consumer goods coming from Japan to the world's biggest market into America. This is a big change. Those containers go out full and they come back full. A system starts to develop. And when you talk about containers, you have to talk about a little bit of vocabulary, because containers are measured in TEUs, which actually stands for 20-foot equivalent unit. Yes, we're still in the foot measurement rather than the meter measurement, right? And TEUs is kind of a bit of a misnomer, because most modern containers that you actually see are 40 foot, right? So like when they say it's a TEU, just double it in terms of the actual length of the container. But think of it as the world agreeing, not as a piece of jargon, but as a way of a basic counting brick. Think of these as kind of Lego bricks. Yeah. So one standard TEU, 20-foot shipping box, becomes the common unit, right? Malcolm was doing 33 foot, but everything now has to standardize. The US military is not going to accept boats from one person, containers for another person. It needs a system. So the ships can now be designed around this common unit. Ports can be designed around it. Crane capacity can be designed around it. Contracts, schedules, yards. And ironically, it's the Vietnam War and the US military and East Asia's commercial rise that forces the standard. And skipping ahead, by 2017, the world's containers ports are handling 752 million TEUs. Yeah. And between 1980 and 2020, the global container throughput increases 20-fold, right? Massive amounts. So container is not just riding trade growth, it is reshaping how trade itself is organized.
Yeah. And once you get that architecture, the old port cities start to break apart too. Because containerization doesn't just change the ship, it changes the physical requirements of ports. You need deeper water, larger terminals, you need stacking yards, specialized cranes, rail links, truck access, much more land. And what this means in practice is that unless you were really looking far to the future, the people who were running these docks and these ports, they just didn't see that this is what's going to happen. And as a result, for example, we had many ports in Manhattan in the old days, and then in the vicinity of that area, Newark actually took over and started building the docks. And when we go to the west coast of the United States, a small town of Oakland all of a sudden became the major container port. So the old dense urban docklands were found not to be ideal. Ports moved outwards. Historic dock areas reorganized. Nowadays, many of those old piers are for restaurants and entertainment. And again, this comes back to your line. The box didn't stop at the port. It forced the port to change, the city to change, the manufacturing map to change, the military logistics system to change, and eventually the power structure of the world economy to change.
Yes. And look, growing up near Liverpool, I was born in the 70s. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. Liverpool basically is a shadow of its former self, right? Because effectively the city, the port was the heart of the city, and it died, right? The jobs vanished, the trade vanished, the people vanished, and it and Liverpool had to work really hard to adapt to that change. And we saw the same in London, but a different consequence. The Port of London was a different beast, right? A long, wide river that took goods very much to the heart of the city. And look at the biggest port in the UK today, the Port of Felixstowe, right? Now, if people aren't familiar with UK geography, Felixstowe's nowhere near London. It's on the Suffolk coast, so basically around the kind of, the what's called the backside of England, the bit that sits out to the right. Felixstowe was a tiny little area of Suffolk that almost, sorry, Suffolk people, no one had heard of. It was a private port. There was no union, right? And then effectively, because there was no opposition, they could actually create a container port almost from scratch. And the hilarious situation there, Marty, you probably don't know this. Do you know who owns the land on which Felixstowe Port is built? Who's the actual landowner?
Probably the royal family.
Good. Very close, but not quite. So it's Trinity College, Cambridge. It's not Cambridge
Good
University.
Lord.
It's
Good Lord.
One of the colleges of Cambridge. Now, this comes from a time where you could literally walk from Oxford to Cambridge, literally by stepping only on the land on which the college is owned, right? Because they were such big landowners, because they received a lot of this as the kind of dowries from former students. And Trinity College of Cambridge has a farm. It's not a port, it's a farm. And then that farm becomes the port, and that port becomes Felixstowe, and that becomes a container ship thing. And it did that because that was the path of least resistance, rather than fight the City of London, organize the ports, modernize the structure. So again, listeners, there's huge changes here. San Francisco puts in money, Seattle puts in money, New Jersey puts in money, everybody puts in money. But ultimately, the box, the container ship, reshapes where the ports are, right? And sometimes it's the line of geographical least resistance, and sometimes it's the line of economics and union least resistance. And Rotterdam becomes this massive port structure, almost out of nothing. So this changes everything. Now, we've spent a lot of time going around the world because it's a global trade story. Now let's swing back to Maersk. So we've done kind of Denmark, America, Vietnam, China, Japan, Korea, Felixstowe. Well done, Felixstowe. Okay, so Maersk comes back into the frame. because catching the wave for Maersk is not automatic, right? A lot of very good firms are very good in one regime and then die in the next, right? So Maersk does not miss the box, right? Its first container route, Marty mentioned it earlier, begins in 1975. And by the early 1990s, it is the largest container line in the world. So just 15 years after entering the containerization business, it's effectively the number one.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's extraordinary because it means Maersk is not just a company that mastered the old shipping world and then rode oil. It's also reorganized itself to basically do the standard logistics system and placing it side. And I love the story of Walmart having a satellite cluster, and kind of Walgreens basically having a supercomputer. What I loved about Maersk in the 1970s is that we have Maersk data in 1970 and Maersk Net in 1975. So they're not just a Danish shipping company moving boats around. They build the technology infrastructure to understand where those boats are. And again, reliability and being able to ship on time is a very important clue to what happens next. Because once the box is standardized, once we have a system, the ship is no longer the whole moat.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the real transition out of this act. Once the box wins, the question changes. It's not about who owns the ship, but it's about who coordinates the network, who designs the terminals, who controls the schedules, who owns the data, who reduces friction at the handoffs. And that's exactly where Maersk goes next. So this act is the hinge of the whole episode. McLean shows that the handoff problem can be attacked. Tandlinger makes the system physically workable, standardized, also international. Korea helps reactivate Japanese industrial power. Vietnam proves the system under pressure. East Asia rises, ports move, manufacturing moves, and Maersk realizes that the future is not just the ship. It's the system around the ship. That's the real container revolution. And that's why the next act is not simply Maersk gets bigger. It is Maersk climbing from transport into coordination.
Yes. And again, don't think about Maersk as a bunch of people who love ships. It would be easy to think of the company like this, right? This is a company that think of it like, are record labels there to sell songs or albums or CDs? Now, we know the answer to this story. Record labels lost their power because the form changed and they didn't change with it, right? So they were all about controlling the artist, the cornered resource, and then the songs to see. Maersk doesn't make that mistake, right? It's not about we love ships and we love oil. It's now containers are the thing. And now it's not about just the container. It's about effectively getting the container to where it needs to be. So Maersk, and when we say Maersk, we're really talking about the grandson. So we've done Peter to AP to McKinney Muller. We introduced him earlier. He was the guy that went to New York and coordinated the fleet post World War II. So he's not a new character in this story. So basically, he focuses, and his entire big contribution to Maersk is the adapting to containerization, putting the foot on the gas in the 1970s to make sure that Maersk is number one by the 90s. Yeah. And that's his defining imprint on the business.
And what is striking is that Maersk McKinney Møller doesn't behave like a romantic visionary here. He behaves like Maersk, which is very rightful with that specific name. He was very careful, serious, skeptical, studious. He and his team spent years studying container shipping before fully committing. I mean, it's from the first container shipment, it took something like 19 years before Maersk went on board. And it's not trend chasing. This is judgment. It's a decision that this is not just a new shipping format. It's a real reordering of world trade. And once he believes that, he does something very revealing. He doesn't nibble. He bets for scale. There's a wonderful detail in the story. Maersk had ordered ships in West Germany, and at the last minute, McKinney Møller has them enlarged from 1,200 TEUs to 1,600 TEUs. That sounds technical, but it isn't. It's a strategy in miniature. Because what that decision says is that I'm not just entering the container world, I'm entering it on the assumption that the scale will decide the winners. And that instinct turns out to be exactly right.
Yeah. So just going back to some of the numbers that we had earlier, by 1990, we talked about Maersk being the number one shipping container company in the world. But they're doing this off a base of 40 countries, right? So they're the global number one, and they're still operating in a handful of countries. 10 years later, they're in 100 countries. By 15 years later, 2015, they're in 130, right? So Maersk scales a lot between 1990 and 2015. So they're already the number one, but they're doing it off the base of 40. Then they move to 100 countries. Then they move to 130 countries. So again, Maersk has to basically spread its infrastructure all the way across the world to achieve these numbers. They cannot just stop at Denmark. They never really started. They started in Denmark, but that was never the whole story.
And that point matters because when people hear Maersk got big in containers, they only think about ships, typically. But what actually happens is much broader than that. The company is becoming present at all places where trade actually succeeds or fails. At the origin ports, the destination ports, inland connections, customer interfaces, at all the messy places where delay becomes cost. That is what global presence really means. It means Maersk is becoming harder to describe as just a carrier. It's becoming something closer to infrastructure. And that is where the strategic problem starts to deepen, because success creates its own danger. The more standardized container shipping becomes, the more comparable parts of the business become too. If everyone is using the same box, if ports are converging around similar physical requirements, if schedules and rates can be compared more easily, then parts of shipping start to drift toward commoditization. Now, not total commoditization. This is still a hard business, still very, very capital intensive, still operationally very unforgiving, but enough commoditization that the question changes. The new question is no longer how do we win the container race? It becomes once the container race is established, where does the moat go? What is our differentiating factor?
Yeah, and I think this is, again, listeners, we primed you with the reflections about what is happening with AI today, right? And again, I'd ask you to reflect on that point as well. When software changes and when software can be produced very quickly, where does the moat go, right? Now, from Merck's perspective, the first answer is still scale. So it's a very good answer for a very long time, a 30-year run in this case. And you can see in their big moves, they acquire Sealand, Malcolm McLean's old business, in 1999. Symbolically enormous, adds to their container ships. Then comes P&O Ned Lloyd in 2005. Again, increasing, bulking up. What you see here is if you look at the list of the top 50 shipping companies in 2000 and you look in 2025, half of them have vanished. There's a huge amount of consolidation during this period because scale economies matter greatly. The boats get bigger. The amount of containers we carry gets bigger. Scale really matters. The scaling laws of the sea and of this particular industry are not subtle. So we do a lot of consolidation, and basically that is the path that Maersk moves on. But ultimately, there is Marty's question still hang there is scale really the moat? Because making the lines bigger, making the network denser, making the system hard to ignore, is that a moat?
Yeah, and it's also very important to remember that the first major acquisition, the Sea and Land, that went very well.
Yep.
The company cultures were very much aligned, but essentially P&O Ned Lloyd was a publicly listed company, and then they made a public offer, and it turned out to be quite a nightmare to integrate. But anyway, the logic works, and by the mid 2000s into the 2010s, bigger is no longer the complete theory of the future. The ocean leg is still essential, but it is no longer enough on its own. And that's where terminals become strategically loaded. Terminals are not glamorous, but they are absolutely full of meaning. The terminal is where the ocean meets the land system. That's where the giant abstract economics of container ships collide with the practical reality of yards, cranes, trucks, trains, labor, custom, weather, and congestion. It is where reliability is either preserved or destroyed. A ship can be magnificent at sea, a network can look beautiful on paper, but if the terminal handoff goes wrong, the customer experiences failure every way. That is why terminals matter. They are one of the first places where begins to understand that control of the cargo journey cannot stop at the water's edge.
Absolutely. Terminals are not an adjacency. They are a big part of the answer for Maersk. So by 2015, APM terminals is a very substantial business and a very substantial business part of Maersk. It's $4 billion in revenue. It's $804 million in EBITDA. It's 36 million TEUs moved and a portfolio of 63 terminals worldwide. So again, we gave you those stats at the beginning. 1 in 7 containers moved around the world is a Maersk container. But also remember, there's a huge interface with all the terminals that are also Maersk terminals. It's not a side business, it's a serious global operating system. And strategically, it tells you something very clear. Maersk is already climbing away from the old idea that the advantage lies purely in the fleet. The scale economics of bigger ships moving around the world, more ships, more containers, etc. It starts to focus its capital and its bets on the transfer points, the choke points, around the places where the cargo stops being maritime and starts becoming logistical.
And that's when we get to Søren Skov, who is the next key person here, who inherits a very different problem than what McKinney-Møller had to deal with. McKinney-Møller's problem was, how do we become great in the age of the box? Skov's problem is much subtler and in some ways much harder. How do we stop the greatness from turning into entrapment by the box? Because by the 2010s, Maersk is already huge. It's already global. It's already one of the defining container lines in the world. But the ocean leg is becoming too easy to compare. And if you remain mainly a carrier, then however impressive you are, you still risk being treated as one input inside somebody else's larger solution. That's the trap. The customer relationship can move upward, the margin can move upward, the coordinating role can move upward, and Maersk can end up being the most sophisticated ocean carrier in the world where somebody else owns the chain. That's what Søren Skov is trying to avoid.
Yeah, and he's interesting because he's almost the opposite of Dynastic Air. Like, he's the first CEO who isn't a family member, right?
Yeah.
He's very much a career operator. He joined Maersk Line in 1983. He works in Copenhagen and New York. He moves to East Asia in 94. He returns to Copenhagen in 98. He runs Maersk Tankers before it's spun off. And then he becomes the CEO of Maersk Line in 2012, then Group CEO in 2016. So he gets a lot of surface area on this business, right? Yeah. And he's built the customer relationships. He's seen the network. He's seen the change in practice. And the answer is not more ships, right? The answer is how can we become a global integrator of container logistics, right? So not how can we put more containers on a boat and move it to someone else's port, but how can we actually be the coordinator of all these boxes? Now, fundamentally, Maersk wants to move from we carry your container to we help run your supply chain. And this is a huge change in ambition because global trade and supply chains, they now exist. Previously, they were not there.
Yeah, and the decisive year is 2016. So 10 years ago, and Maersk reorganizes itself into 2 divisions. One is transport and logistics, and the other one is energy. And this is a very big deal. This marks the end of one version of the company and beginning of another. For decades, Maersk had been sprawling conglomerate, shipping terminals, logistics, oil, gas offshore, multiple heavy businesses accumulated over time. Now it chooses to focus. Now it's saying we are not going to be defined by being a broad maritime industrial conglomerate. We are going to be defined by becoming a more integrated transport and logistics company. That's more than just cosmetics. It's a strategic rewrite. And you can see the strategy becoming very physical. 2019, ABM Terminals Inland Portfolio, 36 business units with more than 100 locations, is moved into Maersk's Logistics and Services organization. That example matters because it's not rhetoric. It's the company literally moving real assets from one internal logic to another. Why? Because if the strategy is integration, then the customer has to see one chain more clearly. Not scattered pieces of different silos, one connecting offering. That is what climbing into coordination looks like when it becomes operational.
I think this is really critical. So MSC, which is Maersk's biggest competitor in this space, Mediterranean Shipping Company, to give it its full title, they're now the largest container shipper in the world. They've taken over from Maersk Mantle. They get bigger ships, more containers, bigger ships, more containers. What Maersk does at this point in 2016 and onwards is they scale the stack, right? So they don't try and compete with MSC in more ships, but basically it's the ships still matter, the network still matter, and the ocean leg still matters, but the company is trying to move its advantage into a thicker layer of the trade system. So this is terminals, customs, warehousing, visibility, workflow, problem solving, and this is going to become a very important word as we go forward, reliability. Getting the stuff when you said you would get the stuff. And again, this is a different strategy to its competitors, right? Because again, everything in global trade is about friction, right? It's a delay here, a missing document here. We're recording this episode in April 2026. There's an Iran US Israeli war going on. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. And we're not going to dwell on that today because we try and make these podcasts relevant in 5 years' time. But it just showcases the modern world is messy, yeah, and stuff happens, and the route that you were going to use maybe isn't available to you anymore. So Maersk focuses its strategy on removing the friction and becoming the organizer of the journey, not just the owner of the boats.
And that doesn't happen in a vacuum because there are other players in the game. There are freight forwarders, customs brokers, warehouse operators, inland logistics firms. And by changing the strategy, Maersk, that used to occupy a certain segment of the sea transportation, all of a sudden starts climbing into the territory of the others. And they are not taking kindly your ambitions of coming to their territory. All the intermediaries who once treated Maersk as one input inside their own solutions is now seeing that Maersk is trying to become the broader solution. So the strategy is elegant, but it's not peaceful. And that is part why the digital layer becomes so revealing.
Yeah, so again, we gave you a couple of Maersk data type references from the 1970s. But to bring the story up to date, just because Maersk decides that future of coordination is its future doesn't mean the rest of the world has to agree with it, right? But there's a couple of interesting stories here that I think we need to unearth. So whenever you're moving something around the world, paper is everywhere. You have duplicated documents, poor visibility, delayed hands-off. You don't have the documents to enter this customs warehouse, to release from this custom warehouse. You could be waiting weeks or months. It's very manual. It's very labor intensive. And this is where TradeLens enters the story. So it's launched in 2018 as a joint project between Maersk and IBM. TradeLens is one of the boldest things that Maersk does in this 2018 period. because the ambition is not small. The ambition is to create a shared digital platform for global trade documentation and shipping visibility. Now, for those of you who are kind of familiar with kind of the Airbus episode, we talk a little bit about what Airbus and Palantir build at this time to basically, manage fleet vulnerability. This is kind of Maersk's attempts to do something similar. But they're not just building it for themselves, they're trying to get the whole ecosystem to adopt TradeLens. Carriers, ports, terminals, custom authorities, forwarders, and shippers. So imagine all of them using their own software system and emailing PDFs around. And now you're like, welcome to my blockchain. Yeah, please step inside and discard all your other systems and join mine. So the logic is completely sound, right? The challenge is that effectively it's not easy to get other people to adopt your systems, right? By 2019, they can get their friends to join. So major carriers like Hapag-Lloyd and One Group have joined, right? And effectively by 2020, IBM is talking about 175 organizations, 10 ocean carriers, data from 600 ports and terminals, and tens of millions of ship tracks, right? So the problem is real. Moving stuff around the world is difficult, right? The uptake is real. They get 175 organizations and 600 ports and terminals on board, and the ambition is real, right? TradeLens and Maersk, they see this as something that needs to happen in the world.
Yeah, and sometimes it happens that if you are too focused on being right, you cease to be effective. And effectiveness and the lack thereof is here seen that the problem is not fake. The struggle with paperwork and visibility of where each and every item are, they are real. Software is not fantasy here. It's the trust challenge, governance challenge, the power challenge. Exactly the same way like the stories between the, let's say, the mid-50s, 1956 to the next 10 years when Malcolm McLean was pushing the container solution. How you get the labor unions on board to be part of the solution of change rather than becoming the problem of trying to avoid any change. It's so important to try to engage the stakeholders if you may want to make a change, even if the journey may take longer, even if the end result may not be as great as what you envision in your mind. It's still the engagement is sometimes worth getting to the end result. And it's so difficult when you have this great vision. It's so difficult to understand that, okay, maybe 60% solution is good enough at this stage. And in many cases, engagement, involvement of all the stakeholders may be worth it. Because the moment when one of the largest physical layers in global shipping tries to rebuild the shared digital layer for the whole industry, there are a number of uncomfortable questions. Who really controls this platform? Who benefits most if it becomes central? Who governs the data? Who writes the rules? Who becomes dependent on whom? And if this works, does Maersk become too powerful? I mean, very, very familiar questions that we are asking today related to AI and its various incarnations. Those are not software questions. They are political and they are governance questions, and they are very rightful questions. And that's why TradeLens is such a revealing episode of the Maersk story. It shows that Maersk is basically right about where value is moving: visibility, workflow, documentation, reducing friction, coordination. But it also shows that owning that layer in a way the whole industry accepts is much harder than simply building it.
Yeah, and listeners, I'd ask you to kind of think back on the Malcolm McLean story that we told earlier. Malcolm McLean, Keith Tansinger, they kind of invented the system, but the industry didn't adopt it, right? They had their system, it worked for them. Someone else had their system, it worked for them. And it was only ironically when there was a forcing function, higher power, the Vietnam War, US military, and then the economics of making money on the return route from East Asia that we actually got standards and a system out of this. And again, what Maersk tries to do is not wrong, as Marty said. And even though it ends in failure, it was still probably the right move to play. It just didn't clearly work. In late 2022, Maersk and IBM announced the shutdown of their blockchain platform. It's wound down by early 2023. I would say the lesson for Maersk is not they misunderstood the future. It's they understood the future correctly. The challenge is how they actually then get that future into being. Yeah, they understood that durable advantage was moving beyond the ship, right? They discovered that the future of coordination is the harder problem to solve and probably their future, but it means that they're going to have to try another approach. Yeah. And again, there's some lessons here for AI. Where will the standards for AI emerge from? Will they be set upon high by the Anthropics and OpenAIs and Googles of this world? Will they emerge from open source projects? Will the forcing function come from economics and governments? This will all be part of our future coming forward. So TradeLens is a failure, but Maersk understands the coordination level. And the second path is where Maersk increasingly puts its weight. How can they basically manage that operational control?
Yeah, and that is the cleanest way to see the whole act. First, McKinney-Miller sees that the box is going to reorder trade and he commits to scale. He helps make Maersk huge in the age of containerization. Then Maersk becomes so successful inside that world that the world starts to standardize around the very thing it mastered. And once that happens, the company faces a new danger, becoming trapped inside a business where the ocean leg alone is too comparable. Then Søren Skov inherits that success trap and tries to solve it by moving Maersk from transportation into coordination, not abandoning ships, not abandoning the sea, but refusing to believe that the sea leg alone will remain the ultimate source of durable power. That's a very strong handoff in strategic terms. McKinney-Miller builds scale around the box. Skov tries to make scale around the box no longer the whole story. And both men are responding to the same force at different moments. The first sees opportunity in standardization. The second sees the danger in standardization. This is elegant, and this is very Maersk. The company that keeps asking, where's the next layer of control? Where's the next layer of discipline? And where's the next durable moat once the old one becomes visible to everybody else?
Yeah, because if it's an obvious problem, you shouldn't be solving it yourself. And again, listeners, now think about the journey we've taken you on. We started in 1904 with break bulk shipping. We went through oil, and the old ports of London, Liverpool, and New York are not the port of Rotterdam, right? The port of Rotterdam is like 100,000 people, basically, and thousands of ships or hundreds of ships coming in and out of day, millions of containers unit. It's a system. But the stuff doesn't stop at the port. It moves on railways and trucks all the way around Europe to make sure that you've got your goods wherever you need them to be. So the container and global shipping creates these supply chains. Now, what's the problem with a supply chain? And the answer's kind of in the question. A chain can be cut, right? Chains have to travel everywhere. So what happens when those choke points become more, they matter more? When resilience starts to outbreak efficiency. And this is where our next act begins, because we've built the architecture for Maersk, right? Maersk has built its global supply chain, and now we're about to, sadly, spoiler alert, hit the storm. Because when we enter Act 5, by the late 2010s, Maersk has already made its strategic choice. It's done that. We're not going scaling laws, build more ships route, right? What we're trying to become is an integrated container logistics company that wants to connect and simplify supply chains. But sadly for Maersk, life is going to get a lot more difficult quickly.
Yes. And it's important to remember that rather than demonizing the suppliers of these services, it's very important to remember that what are the customers actually going after? The customers who are shipping their stuff, they are looking for fast shipments, lowest cost. They are not talking about the resilience of the supply chain. They are talking about costs. So the whole system, in a way, we could say that the Maersk and its competitors are responding to a market need. This is what the markets want. The markets are not focused on resilience and the survivability of under these stresses. And one of the modern shocks was NotPetya in 2000, and it shows something much larger than Maersk got hacked. NotPetya begins inside the Russian-Ukraine conflict that started in 2014. NotPetya is the malware that spreads through Ukrainian accounting software and then jumps outward into globally connected companies. Maersk is one of the clearest examples of what that means in practice. A company with a presence inside Ukraine and operating globally through interconnected digital systems gets infected by a cyber weapon aimed at a geopolitical target. Maersk later said that the attack cost it around $250 to $300 million. So the lesson is not merely that cyber risk is real. The lesson is that when computers run global trade, the world is globally connected. War no longer stays local. A geopolitical attack in one country can ripple through the company's ports, bookings, terminals, documentation, the customer systems worldwide, like a pandemic. In other words, if software has become a part of the infrastructure of trade, then cyber contagion can become part of a geopolitical contagion.
Absolutely. And if people are not familiar with this story, I would encourage you to look online for basically NotPetya and the hack that happened. It's well documented. And again, just Marty spelled it out really clearly. Russia wanted to attack Ukraine, right? They were trying to destabilize the Ukrainian financial system. So they released basically this malware just before New Year's Eve in 2017. Now, they didn't aim to hack Maersk. That wasn't the objective. The objective was to kick Ukraine hard, and they did do that. But because Maersk is global, and because it had an operating business inside Ukraine, and because it used the same accounting software as everybody else in Ukraine, basically the malware enters Maersk's system and goes across the globe instantly. And there's a hilarious story that they have one terminal, one record of all their basically where all the ships are in the world, and it's in Ghana, right? And because there was a local power cut, the Ghana terminal basically is not connected, so it doesn't get malware. So they're ringing around the world because there's no emails, there's nothing else. They're ringing around all their terminals going, has anybody got a copy? Is anybody offline? And the Ghanese guys are about to plug this machine back to the internet. And you can imagine the guys in Copenhagen or wherever going, no, don't do it. And then Maersk literally has to fly somebody on the plane because the Ghanese guy can't get out. He doesn't have the visa to go to Denmark. And they get this one sole backup copy of their entire global database. And then they rebuild their system. Now, again, just to be clear, the Russian government was not going after Maersk. Tons of companies get hit by NotPetya. But it just shows you the fragility of the global system that we have built, right? So NotPetya is a moment when Maersk discovers in a very brutal way, it is not just a fleet. It is not just a network. It is the operating system for trade. You can't be the operator of global logistics, container logistics, and not be the operating system. You can't do the Meta, Facebook, we're not responsible for the news, we're just a platform. Maersk is responsible for global trade and therefore needs to now protect itself very, very powerfully. The problem for Maersk, spoiler alert, is there's a certain disease found in Wuhan, China that causes another problem.
Yeah, and that's the second and much larger test, because COVID-19 does two contradictory things at once. First, it vindicates logistics more forcefully than almost anything in modern history. Suddenly, the whole world understands that shipping and logistics are not background plumbing. They determine whether inventories arrive, factories can run, and inflation remains tolerable. The second, it generates extraordinary profits for the container lines and for Maersk in particular. In 2021, Maersk revenue rises to $61 billion, EBITDA to $24 billion, and free cash flow to $16.5 billion. In 22, revenue rises again to $81 billion and EBIT reaches $31 billion, but the business mix is revealing a path. In 22, Ocean contributes $64 billion of revenue, while Logistics and Services $14.4 billion and Terminals $4 billion. So COVID-19 proves that customers will pay heavily for reliability when reliability vanishes. But it also shows that Maersk, despite all the strategic talk about integration, is still overwhelmingly dependent on ocean economics when the stress really hits.
Absolutely. And again, I think we all forget the pandemic. I know it was a terrible time for most people, but we all forget it was only 6 years ago. Two things happen which are really important, which plays out in Maersk figures. Number one, global trade stops. China stops, so therefore global trade stops, right? And kind of Maersk gets paid because effectively its ships aren't going anywhere, but it's a real crisis. Then American customers start buying stuff, and basically global trade has to restart very, very quickly. Freight rates surge. That's why Maersk makes so much money, right? But the problem then is the system is designed for easy flow of continuous goods. It's not designed to suddenly stop and then restart. Yeah, so you get these huge bottlenecks or choke points. The port of Los Angeles in 2021, like there's a line of boats past the horizon. There's hundreds of boats waiting to disembark to take all those sofas, TVs, and barbecues to Americans, right? It shows that COVID helps Maersk's profit line, no question about it, but it also shows that Maersk is kind of half right? It proves the company is right that coordination and dependability matter enormously, but it also proves that currently the ocean leg is the big profit pool in this business, right? So I think it's very difficult for Maersk to say at this point we are a coordination and logistics company, because we're very much still we're Nvidia the GPU company, not Nvidia the kind of full stack company, right? So it's a moment of real stress, mainly an ocean freight business with important adjacent capabilities. So in 2021, Maersk learns to listen that it hasn't quite moved into the ASML infrastructure layer. It's still very much subject to these cycles in the industry and cycles within global trade.
And I guess these what you just concluded very nicely. It was also found out by the management of Maersk, and around the same time when COVID was still running high, the acquisitions start. I mean, 2020, Maersk acquires Performance Team, adding premium warehousing, distribution, e-commerce fulfillment, and inland transport in the United States with 24 warehousing sites at signing, and later a combined North American network of 46 warehouses and nearly 600 trucks after integration with Maersk's existing warehousing and inland assets. In 2021, it acquires Visible SCM, giving it stronger US e-commerce fulfillment and parcel capability, with the claim that customers could reach 75% of US direct-to-consumer market within 24 hours and 95% within 48 hours. In 21-22, it acquires LF Logistics for about $3.6 billion, adding a premium omni-channel fulfillment business in Asia Pacific with 220 warehouses across 14 countries and around 10,000 employees. That is not a small adjacency. That's a major warehousing and inland logistics footprint in one of the most important manufacturing regions of the world. In 22, it completes the acquisition of Pilot Freight Services for an enterprise value of roughly $1.8 billion, adding North American first mile, middle mile, last mile, big and bulky, and white glove delivery capabilities. Maersk said it gave it approximately 150 facilities in the US when combined with the existing network. That is strategy finally becoming very, very physical.
Yeah, and again, I think listeners took the money that it made in the pandemic and it basically used itself to basically move into this adjacency. So this is not Maersk becoming a little bit more logistically. These are really big numbers. These are really big plays, right? It is trying to reduce the number of times a customer has to hand off accountability, right? So with Performance Team, it gives you warehousing and short distance transporting of containers. Visible SCM gives you e-commerce fulfillment and parcel reach. LF Logistics gives you Asia Pacific omni-channel warehousing. Pilot gives you first mile to last mile and big bulk delivery. And air freight gives you time critical optionality. Maersk is no longer just the ocean leg. They're using this money, they're using this to basically build this additional supply lane on land, in the air, to become accountable owner of more of the chain themselves, rather than the person who owns the boats and owns the ports, and that's all they do.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing is that they tried to have this overarching control utilizing software platforms. And here, rather than just relying on the software, I mean, it's essentially you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? And here they are really walking by becoming actively and integrally involved with the actual activities that they wanted to control in the first place. And what's also very remarkable here is that the air freight matters too, because it shows that Maersk understands integration is not only horizontal across land and sea, it's also modal. 2021, Maersk announces the acquisition of Senator International, a freight forwarder with a strong air freight offering, and says it will also expand its controlled air network with 3 leased cargo aircraft from 2022 and 2 new Boeing freighters by 2024. Then in 2024, Maersk Air Cargo takes delivery of its first Boeing 777Fs. The first Boeing 777s owned by a Danish airline, with Maersk saying it will support up to 6 direct weekly flights between China and Northern Europe. That matters because air freight is not just yet another business line. It's what gives an integrator optionally for high value, time critical, or disrupted supply chains. It's the opposite of being trapped inside ocean only economics.
Yes. And we won't get through an episode of talking about global logistics and trade without talking about a little ship, not so little, called the Ever Given, who unfortunately most people will forget the name, but they'll remember the message and the image. It gets stuck in the Suez Canal in March 2021. Strong winds, pilot error, who knows? Basically, the ship goes sideways, and unfortunately, the Suez Canal can go 2 ways at certain points, but at this point, this is one-way road, and it gets stuck. Both ends get stuck. And the whole world suddenly sees that trade depends on these narrow corridors, right? And precise timing. So the Ever Given isn't really about the ship, it's about the symbol of global trade breaking. Just with one ship, strong winds, in a canal, done. Yeah. And again, we see this with the Red Sea, Straits of Hormuz today, right? So again, what happens when the Suez Canal goes down, all of these things, is it's not that we don't have other options, but those other options require 4,000 miles more travel and a transit time of 1 to 3 weeks. We go round the Cape of Good Hope, we go round Africa, we go down the bottom, and we come up the other side. So again, it's not that we can't do this, it's the fact that basically the routes change, the timing changed, and the ports then have to absorb all that change. One of the problems with the pandemic is everybody stopped, and then everybody started at once, and everyone then arrived at the port at once, and that created the blockage. Yeah, so this is not a bad week, the Ever Given. This is structural strain on the system.
Yeah, and I mean, even more, once you are all lined up to go through the Suez Canal, you cannot, if you are number 10 or number 20 on the line, you cannot all of a sudden turn that huge container ship around and change to another route.
Let's go via Africa.
Yeah. No, you don't do that with a ship of that size. I mean, because those ships are not designed to be the most maneuverable ships around. They are designed to be very reliable and very low energy consuming pipelines that are not steered very heavily to any direction. And then we get to the Panama Canal. I mean, it's a canal. It's between 2023 and 24, there was a drought. The canal cut the daily transits sharply. I mean, a typical would be 36 vessels a day, and it was all of a sudden cut to 22. And it means that the fiscal 2024 transits fell about 29% year on year. So now the architecture is being hit from every side. Cyber war, pandemic, blocked canals, conflict rerouted trade, water stress. And that is exactly why the category battles changes. The question is no longer simply who has the biggest fleet. It becomes who can keep the chain dependable when the world is disorderly.
Yeah, and listeners, we had a little bit of a difficulty kind of what category is Maersk the winner of, right? Because ironically, we've told the story of global trade, but we've also told the change in category leadership, right? So is Maersk the biggest container company? Well, no, because MSC is today. They were in 1990. Was it the biggest oil tanker? They were, but they're not now. So again, think about this really around this chain of global logistics that Maersk is now trying to operate. So they do this a number of ways, one of which is have friends, right? So basically, Maersk and MSC announced in January 2023 that their 2M alliance, so Maersk and MSC, that they played together, they were friends, and they basically ended their alliance in January 2025, right? And partly that's because they're embarking on different strategies. MSC is more boats, scaling laws. Maersk is how do we basically scale the stack? And that generally brings you into conflict because ultimately, as Marty said earlier, you're starting to do something that the other business person thought it was theirs, right? You're starting to become both the poacher and gamekeeper in the supply chain. So again, this changes. So basically, TM is dead, right? But just because the king is dead doesn't mean we can't have a new king. So Maersk announces a new alliance, Marty.
And that alliance is Gemini.
Not to be confused with the Google model of the same name.
Yeah, well, that's another story. Branding is not easy, as we know.
Gemini twin. They're doing a twin thing. That's what they're doing.
It's branding is not rocket science, but it's bloody hard work sometimes.
Absolutely.
Together with Hapag-Lloyd, Maersk launched the Gemini Cooperation in February 2025, with around 340 vessels, 57 services, and 3.7 million TEUs. That was the 20-foot equivalent units of capacity. But the important number is not the fleet size, it's the claim. Schedule reliability above 90% once the network is fully phased in. By early 2020, the partners were saying that the network was already performing at around 90% reliability. That's a very strong strategic statement in an industry where through much of 2024, global schedule reliability stayed around 50 to 55%, and even the best performing major carriers were usually only in the high 50s or low 60s. Maersk itself was often the most reliable among the largest carriers, but still nowhere near 90%. So Gemini is not saying we have a slightly nicer network, it's saying we are trying to redefine what customers should expect from liner shipping. This is category warfare, and of course the key question is, how does it compare with the other available solutions when it comes to the cost for the end user? And that's really the question that we don't know yet about, but this is all about what the customers are willing to pay for.
Yes, and look, there are a bunch of stories that we skipped over that are super valuable to tell. The whole change in oil prices during the 1950s, oil goes from $3 per barrel and skyrocket up, right? Malcolm McLean, who was so well sure-footed on some respects, ends up basically making a wrong bet on slower mover, lower priced, high priced oil. I use less of it by my boats moving slower. He gets caught out. The reason I mention this is decarbonation is another thing that Maersk needs to steer through. So Maersk's policy today is a real risk. And I don't say that as a Wall Street analyst, this company is doing the wrong thing risk. It's a risk, right? And it's not a bad thing or a negative thing. It's just it has a risk. Shipping is responsible for roughly 3% of global greenhouse emissions. These are big boats with a lot of oil moving around the world. And even though the cost of goods is very, very cheap, yeah, we're way below that Malcolm McLean's 94% reduction from breakbulk shipping. The direction of travel is pretty clear. We have to reduce global emissions. The International Maritime Organization, the IMO's greenhouse gas strategy, points towards net zero shipping emissions by or around 2050. Yeah, with meaningful uptake of zero or near zero emission fuels by 2030. It means the industry has to change. The question is, like always, how, right? And what will be the cost? Maersk's answer today, and it'll be very interesting to track this over the next 5 years, is green methanol. Okay. And the reason why it's a risk, the reason I mentioned that at the beginning, is will the customers pay? Will you have the supply of green methanol in the right places to get your boats that are right to where they need to be? Are you locking yourself technology in the wrong fuel, or are you locking yourself into the right fuel when we have a global oil shortage? How will that play out? And again, it's always this timing issue. Are you moving too early with the technology? Are you adopting the right technology? Should you wait and see what your rivals do? If you jump, will the supply chain materialize? Yeah, this is a real wager for Musk.
Yeah, exactly. And this is not just greenwashing your strategy statements. This is Maersk choosing to put real capital and strategic reputation behind a fuel pathway before the industry standard is settled. By 2023, it secures green methanol for the maiden voyage of Laura Maersk, the first methanol-enabled container vessel. It says it will equip 25 container vessels with dual-fuel methanol engines. And by 2024, it begins introducing large methanol-enabled ships of about 16,000 TEUs on Asia-Europe routes. Why is that risky? Because if green methanol remains scarce and or expensive, Maersk could end up carrying a cost base that competitors dodge for years. If customers will not constantly pay a premium for lower emissions transport, Maersk bears more of the burden itself. And if another fuel pathway, a slower regulation, ends up dominating, Maersk may have moved earlier and harder than was financially optimal. So this is not a PR exercise. It's a strategic gamble on the future operating standard of shipping.
The advantage for Maersk is they've been here before. This is a company, we've told their story, right? It's taken 2.5 hours, but we've told their story. Peter Maersk Moller sees sail give way to steam, right? The company starts in breakbulk and moves to oil, then containers. Now Maersk is trying to move early in the transition from legacy fossil fuels to something cleaner. In each case, the company is asking the same question. If the standard is going to change, do we want to wait for it or do we want to shape it? With TradeLens, they tried to shape it. Yeah. Now, why is this green wager belongs in this episode? It's not a moral decoration, but it's a recurring, very Maersk instinct around how do we shape the standards? How do we work out what's the next 20 to 30 years are going to be for us?
Yes, and if we stand back a little bit from the whole act, the shape is much clearer now. Sørensen co-builds the architecture, simplify the group, bulk up warehouses, inland, parcel and air, and make the integrator claim real in assets, not just software and soft words. Then the world hammers that architecture with the Russia-Ukraine cyber spillover, COVID, Suez, Red Sea, Panama, and of course, we have the Strait of Hormuz today. Then Maersk has to choose how it wants to compete. Break with MSC, build Gemini around reliability, and place an early bet on methanol and decarbonized shipping. That is not a sequence of random recent events. It's one story, the architecture meeting the storm.
Yeah. So as we bring Maersk's story to an end, and we're going to go into analysis in a second, again, the numbers tell a good story. Maersk is 55 billion in revenue. The majority of that comes from ocean, then logistics and services around 15 billion, and terminals at 5 billion. Right? So ocean is still the big pillar, right? And Maersk has not moved beyond being a pure carrier, right? But it is starting at this point in time in 2026. Maersk has moved beyond the ship in its head, right? And the real question is, will Maersk become this category leader for global container trade coordination? And unfortunately, we've already seen Maersk tested a lot in this first in the last 10 years, 2016 to today. Sadly, it's going to look pretty choppy on the oceans and in the globally for the next 20 years. Maersk has to have the power to survive this oncoming storm. So, Marty, in terms of analysis, is it just now? Normally we use Hamilton Helmers 7 powers, yeah, but really with Maersk, is it just scale economies? Right? It's just scale. Is that what really matters? That's the obvious one that we start with. Yeah. Is that all? Is that the entire story?
Well, I mean, let's see. Of course, scale economies, that's there. The historically the scale showed up first in the classic forms of larger fleets, denser route networks, more containers, bigger bargaining power, broader terminal footprint, and lower unit costs spread across a larger system. That's straightforward. But I think the more interesting point is that Maersk scale is migrating. Rather than just bigger ships, bigger fleets, bigger network, the new scale logic is bigger system. And we've talked about terminals, inland customs, warehousing, all that, air freight. And I think this is really important. They are trying to renew themselves. And when you have a company of that size, you cannot twinkle the system just a little bit. I mean, you need
Absolutely.
you need to make moves because you are a global player. So this is the move from vessel to the stack. It's real.
No, it's definitely real. And Marty, do you think they're going to make it? If we look at this company, if we return to them in like 10 years time, do you think that because they've MSC is trying to scale the ship, Maersk is trying to scale the stack. Do we think from what we've seen so far, and the strategy is still early in this corporate history, do you think that they're going to make it? They're going to make the transition?
I absolutely do. I mean, of course, I'm not a marine transport expert, but all what I've read, and I've read a lot. I mean, just for this specific case, I've gone through a lot of documents. It is absolutely clear that if you are staying put, you will be overrun by competition. So you got to do something. And what they are doing is something that sounds very logical to me. Something that if at least based on the knowledge I have, I would very gladly endorse something like that. The biggest bet, which is very, very difficult, is really the energy. The whole methanol thing.
Yep.
That's a huge bet. That's a huge bet. But methanol, a biomethanol or renewable methanol, it's a great source of energy. I just hope that it will be available in scale.
So again, listeners, do your own research on this one. I would strongly recommend you go and look at, again, pros and cons. There isn't the scale of biomethanol existing in the world today that Maersk needs. It's just not there. So this is we will build in a new direction, and we will, through the sheer bulk of our order book, create the supply. Now we could look back to Henry Ford. Do they create it themselves? Do they work with partners? We will create the supply that we need, and we'll get our ships off basically diesel. And I think, again, in a world where diesel becomes potentially short or very expensive, this could be a very good move if that supply chain runs out. Okay, so that's scale economies. Marty, what about process power? I think Maersk has this one in spades, right? Because effectively, you cannot run a global logistics business in 130 companies with 60 terminals, Port of Felixstowe, blah, 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 without having the process power. I think this is a slam dunk. I think this is their strongest power now.
Yeah, and this is so easy to agree with you on this. That's where the family and institutional history matters. A lot of companies can make one brilliant move, Much fewer can make several across the decades and across changing industrial regimes. Maersk seems to have built an organizational habit of asking, where's the friction now, and where's the future value? What control points matter now and in the future? And that's why the company story doesn't feel random. It's none of the things that we have talked. Even TradeLens, even if it failed, it wasn't random. It was an attempt that probably had to be taken, even if it didn't succeed. But essentially, we understand why they did it. Even the methanol is not random, but of course, huge risks. And here is really the point that if you are running a company with this length, I mean, it's the same with Roche. You need to move to the place where coordination is becoming newly valuable. I mean, Roche made very, very similar changes all over the history. You just gotta move when the environment around you is changing.
Yeah, so I agree. Very much agree. So process power, I'm going to rank it as we go. So I would say process power is probably their strongest. Scale
Mm-hmm.
economies, particularly in the stack, is kind of number two. I would kind of skip over counter positioning because they did lots of counter positioning earlier in their story and they're still doing it in terms of the methanol switch. But I'd be interested in your opinion on switching costs, right? Particularly as Maersk is moving from this carrier to this coordination. What does switching cost then mean when you start to own the trucking company and own the warehouse and own the airline that the goods travel on? Does this create a phenomenal empire? They almost become the Standard Oil of kind of coordinated transport. They own everything, they touch everything. Or
Yeah.
is this strategy they push up against all their frenemies, yeah, their previous friends that now become the enemies because they've stood on their turf? Where are we on switching costs?
Well, I have two comments on that. The first thing, even if Maersk is a phenomenal company, it's still, I mean, it was 1 out of every 7 containers in their hands.
Yep.
I mean, some sources say 20% of all container traffic is in their hands. There's the remaining 80%. So the customers do have options. Absolutely do. So I think they are doing well in trying to raise the switching costs, trying to lock in the customers, but I don't think I don't think they are there. I don't think that their role is so critical that another supply or delivery chain could not compete with them head on. And the other thing that I want to say here, which I think is very, very tricky, is that the whole world from the mid 50s until just a few years ago was based on very, very open trade,
Yeah.
very predictable and low tariffs.
I love that.
And
What was a tariff before Trump came to power?
well,
My kids
exactly.
hadn't even heard of one.
There you go. And now we're in a situation where this, let's say, this open global collaboration is being threatened by geopolitics. And it means that once again, this shock may be actually even longer lasting than some of the other shocks that we discussed. And I don't think that Maersk has the lock in to say that switching costs are a competitive advantage for them. I don't
No.
think so.
And I think you summed it up really nicely earlier when you talk about the first chapter of Merce is the get to a standard and then optimize against that standard, and then at some point the fact that it's a standard becomes the trap, right? That you are the same as everybody else, right? And again, I think if we look at the other powers, if we skip over branding because it's nice to have blue containers, but nobody buys you because you got a blue container. Sorry. Cornered resource, they do have a power, I think, here, right? Because they have the terminals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as long as we've learned from history, the port of Felixstowe existed mainly because London was too kind of shallow and too long to get the containers in and out, and too unionized and too difficult, right? And Felixstowe just came in and established it. Maersk owns the terminals. The terminals for me are still more of The terminals, the warehouse, the logistics behind that, that's still more of a
Some of
cornered
them,
Riost. Okay, go on.
some of them, but not all of them. I mean, there are still alternatives in the marketplace. More alternatives. I mean, if you think of cellular phones, you have Apple and you have Google. They are controlling the cell phone infrastructure. So there's a duopoly. But even in terminals, there are more alternatives. So, I mean, I wouldn't rely on cornered resource being
Oh, no,
being
I
some
agree.
sort of
I
a
think
moat.
it's definitely a weaker power. I think, when
Yeah.
you stank the powers at the moment, their strongest powers are process power and scale economies, no
Here, here.
question. Right. And I think then the jury's out a little bit on switching costs, and then the other ones kind of fade. And a little bit around is how they execute their strategy. Okay. So finish the analysis. Quintessence, Marty, what is your verdict on Maersk? We've told their story. We've done an analysis. It's a great company. We don't study companies that aren't great. It's definitely a category leader in this container logistics aspect. What do you kind of stand back from this? Where are you?
Well, I think we've talked about high-tech companies quite a bit, and we are in love with ASML and with Roche and with Airbuses and those who are very technology companies. This is logistics, and like a retired Air Force general once said from U.S. Air Force, said that logistics is not rocket science, but it's a lot of hard work, and that's good to remember that sometimes the biggest things that you do are not necessarily the most flashy ones, but it's your ability to year over year continue doing the hard work and keep the wheels turning. It's very admirable, and it's often overlooked and underappreciated, because a lot of the stuff that keeps our economies and our world alive is really a lot of hard and boring work. So I think this is a great success story, especially when we think about the whole story that it started in this little town in Denmark. So this is an absolutely fabulous growth story that has several figureheads that we have mentioned here, and it's a unique story. It's clearly a unique growth story from a small Nordic country, and it has to be appreciated that way. The only thing that I do hope is that they are able to maintain the leading position by reinventing the wheel when it's needed. This is not an easy thing. I don't think that they can be comfortable with their position. They have a strong position, but they are being threatened by the coastline pirates and all kinds of devious figures that are there all the time. But I think this is a refreshing story, because especially the capital intensive nature of this business, it's a remarkable achievement.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
when you make all that happen. So this is clearly one of those companies that we as Europeans can be genuinely proud of.
100%. And I very much second that. I've been so impressed with Maersk by digging into their history, understanding global trade, the fact that they've managed to survive in a very difficult industry where margins are thin and reliability is a difficult question. And I wish them the best of luck. They are trying to do a very difficult thing at the moment. They're trying to become infrastructure like ASML did. They're trying to become infrastructure and an integrator at the same time. And that is very hard to do. And we wish them the best of luck. So, Marty, we finished the Maersk episode. Where are we going next month?
Well, there's surprisingly between our category leader stories, there's some glue in between them. And when Maersk mastered the box that moves items, our next category leader mastered the box that moves people, the humble elevator. Company founded in Finland in 1910, just a few years after Maersk. The company's name is Kone. In 2025, last year, they generated 11 billion in sales and around 1.8 million units in its service base, and roughly 2 billion people moved every day.
Now, listener, if this sounds smaller than shipping containers across oceans, it isn't, because When Marty originally pitched me on this idea, it was like, the elevator company? Why do we want to do the elevator company? Like, we're doing global shipping and the Panama Canal, etc., etc. And then what really struck me is the box inside the building changed the way that we think about cities, right? So we moved the building becomes recurring revenue machines. Cities became denser. This whole landscape that we live in changed because we could go up, not just across. And I love that the fact the first name for the elevator is vertical railways, because we didn't even have a vocabulary to describe a box moving vertically, but we had a vocabulary to describe a box or a carriage moving horizontally. So the first elevators become vertical railways. And I love that. So again, for me, I got excited about this episode because effectively of this whole opportunity to turn and reduce the size of cities.
Yeah, and of course here, not just selling the box, it's your stewardship of covering the entire life cycle of the building, having new equipment, then service, then modernization. It's not about the box anymore. It's about providing this mobility service to the people who are in buildings or in other built infrastructure. That's the hidden trick, which is so important, and also in revenue part, 42% of the revenues are coming from service, 21% from modernization, and 36% from new building solutions. So it's the biggest business area is the service business, which tell you exactly where the compounding engine sits.
Absolutely. So join us next month when Marty and I do a home match on Category Leaders, where we study best in the world companies based in Europe, and we come back home to Finland with Kone. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. See you later.